Welcome to the Future of Work afternoon session. We have heard from experts on topics from higher education, teaching, equity, demographics on the who of our community who's been affected by COVID-19, and the future of our community. Now I'm honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Ray Perryman. Dr. Ray Perryman is sometimes referred to as a genius, a world-class scholar, the unofficial state economist. Dr. Ray Perryman is the president and CEO of the Perryman Group, an economic research and analysis firm based in Waco, Texas. Dr. Perryman has held numerous academic positions in his career. He has authored several books and more than 400 academic papers. He has authored more than 2,500 trade articles, publishes a subscription forecasting service, and a monthly newsletter. He writes a weekly syndicated news column. He hosts daily radio commentary and appears regularly on NPR. He has served as the president of both Southwestern Economic Association and the Southwestern Society of Economists. His current academic roles include Senior Research Fellow of the IC2, IZ2 Institute of the University of Texas and the Institute's Distinguished Professor of Economic Theory and Method of the International Institute for Advanced Studies. Dr. Perryman is a leader in economics and so happy he could find time to meet and spend time with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to visiting with everyone for a few minutes.
Can you give me a moment? Can somebody
Sure.
go in and mute everybody except for Dr. Perryman? Somebody has music playing in the background. Go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to visit with you today for a few minutes and try to give you the perspective from the standpoint of economics for some of the issues you're dealing with, and try to give you kind of a big picture view of the economy and the situation we're in right now. Bring it down to Texas, bring it down to Austin area, talk about the workforce implications, and hopefully have some time at the end for some questions. If you feel a need to stop me in the middle for some questions, that's fine too. I understand somebody's going to moderate that for me, Daniel or somebody else. And if I need to be interrupted, feel free. To sort of start out on this, the first thing I want to talk about is the fact, I'm sure you all saw this morning, or many of you saw this morning, the gross domestic product numbers came out, 32.9% drop in the second quarter, largest drop in the history of the country. And that sort of thing. By the time we finish here today, I hope I can give you some perspective on that. It's a very significant situation, but it's also very different from things we've seen in the past. And that's the first thing I want to point out. This is so atypical that we don't have a lot to go on. We keep trying to forecast it. We released some new numbers yesterday. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But it's atypical. It's not something we've seen before. Historically, if you go back to the last 50 or 60 years, the recessions we've had have occasionally been brought on by an outside force. Certainly the 1973 Arab embargo comes to mind and the impact that had on the economy for over an extended period of time. And then beyond that, we already had a recession going on back in around 2000, 2001, and the 9/11 certainly made that one worse. So we've occasionally had these outside forces come into the economy, but not at this magnitude. Most of our recent recessions have been because of something we did that, frankly, was stupid. That could be the case of allowing a mortgage bubble and speculation to drive us down. That was the last one, and the worst one we'd had since the Great Depression before this one. The one before that was doing essentially the same thing in the dot-com world, and some of you may remember the dot-com bust that we had. The one before that was when we did a similar thing with the savings loan industry. And the limited partnerships and things like that. And that takes us all the way back to all the ones we've had back since the 80s. So basically, normally it's some structural problem in the economy that we, to some extent, created ourselves. That's not the situation today. When we started this, we were in the longest economic expansion in the history of the country. We were well into our 11th year of economic expansion, uninterrupted. And so the good news about that, I suppose, is if you come into it without anything broken, you don't have a lot to fix as you come out of it. So we don't have any big structural problems that we have to resolve in the economy itself. What we do have, of course, is a health crisis that we have to resolve. And I've said from the beginning, I've said to anybody that would listen, I've said on the front page of the New York Times, this is an economic crisis caused by a health crisis. If you want to solve the health crisis, the economic crisis, you have to get a handle on the health crisis. That may be some combination of vaccines, herd immunity, treatment, social distancing, and the things we're doing now, whatever it is. But it's very important that we get the health crisis under control to truly allow the economy to come back. And so, but given that, if we can keep the structure together, and I'll say a couple of words about that later, but if we can keep the structure together and then work through this, we can come back from this a lot faster than the last one. And I'll kind of, again, a little bit later tell you what I think about all that. Being an economist, what we always try to do is through our lens is try to see what history can teach us about something. And in all honesty, history can't teach us a lot here. It really can't. The closest thing we have to this is the 1918 Spanish flu, which people talk about a lot these days. And in some ways, it was much worse. As pandemics go, it was much worse. Our population was a third the size it is today, yet that one killed 600,000 people and infected 30 million people that we know about. So from that perspective, much worse situation. However, it was a different world. We were not a world power in 1918. Obviously, the way in which our mobility was nowhere near the same it is today. Our Federal Reserve System was only 5 years old. We'd only had a central bank for 5 years since 1836. And they didn't have the powers and the abilities that they have and the mandates they have today. We didn't really learn a lot about economic policy and how to do economic policy until the 30s and 40s, when the Great Depression came along, which kind of made a necessity the mother of invention there. So there's just too many things that are not the same. There's not a lot we can learn, but there's a little bit, but not a lot. So basically, we kind of come into it and sort of observed it unfolding. And the first thing we saw in this country as an impact of this from an economic perspective was supply chain interruptions, because it started in China and some parts of Asia. We buy a lot of component parts for things we manufacture here in the United States from China. A lot of chips that are used in the manufacturing here in Austin come from China. We buy a lot of consumer goods that are made in China. The first thing we saw was just some interruptions that were disrupting our supply chains. Then as the world started doing some shutting down, still before it really got to us in a big way, we began to see the oil market start to get a little soft because demand was going down. And then we began to see, as it sort of edged in here, the travel and tourism was the first thing we really saw. And really a watershed moment was when South by Southwest was canceled this year, here right there in Austin, because literally the next week you're going to have 500,000 people come to Austin and be there for quite an extended period of time and spend a lot of money and have a lot of fun and that sort of thing. And that just went away. Of course, shortly after that, the sports seasons went away, many other things went away. And then as it came to our shores more, we had this huge economic downturn that was, I guess, the watershed of it was in April. We began to see some of it in late February, a lot in early March, but April was really the month where we saw most things shut down. Some things have begun to come back in May and June. We hope that continues, but we also have to deal with the fact that the health issues have become more alarming in the last few weeks here, and we have to be mindful of that as well. So that's just sort of a little background on it. Now, what does it mean for the economy, the U.S. economy? I want to try to give you a perspective on this. The Great Recession back in 2008 was the worst recession we had since the Great Depression. In the worst month of the Great Recession, almost 700,000, the worst week of the Great Recession, almost 700,000 people filed new claims for unemployment. 700,000. We had a week in this one where 6.6 million people filed for unemployment. We have now it's now gone down some and stabilized for the last 4 or 5 weeks in around 1.2 1.3 to 1.5 million initial claims. That's twice as many. And that's a stabilized number that's 1/6 of the worst number. It stabilized at a level twice as high as the worst month of the Great Recession. So the labor market's been hit very hard, and that's obvious. I mean, we know when you shut down the restaurants, when you shut down the bars, when you shut down the salons, and those are very labor-intensive industries. A lot of people work in those industries, and then of course other industries are suffering their own difficulties. So it's very difficult to get a handle on this. It was so rapid and so strong. In April, we lost 20 million jobs, 22 million jobs in April. We had lost a few more back in March as well, but we lost about over 20 million jobs in April. In May, we got back 2.5 million, biggest jump in history. That's where you have to be careful about all these numbers because it was the biggest jump in history, but we lost almost 10 times that many the month before. So you have to keep all these statistics straight and try not to focus too much because we'll see a lot of the biggest and baddest and worst in history here, and it's because of the base we're working from, and you have to be careful. The next month is 4.8 million jobs. That led a lot of people to talk about a V recovery. I'm sure you've heard that phrase. A lot of folks are going to have a V recovery. Well, anybody that thinks that has never seen a V, because in 2 months we went down 22 million jobs. The next 2 months we went up 7 million. That's great, but it's only a third of what we lost. So it's not a V. If it was a V, it would have gone up the same amount in the next 2 months as it went down the previous 2 months. It may be a pretty a check mark with a pretty good slope on it, but it's not a V. And obviously the reason so many jobs come back so quickly is because once you open the restaurants, once you open the hotels, once you open the bars, those kinds of things, the salons, again, they're labor intensive. So a lot of those folks get rehired very quickly. And so that's why you see so many jobs come back quickly. Then it would level off under normal circumstances. This is not even normal circumstances because we've had to pull back on some of the openings and that sort of thing. So it's going to be a little slower process than a V, but still, nonetheless, it has been a nice comeback. Now, the GDP numbers went down about 5% in the last quarter. As I said this morning, they told us it went down 33% for all practical purposes this quarter. The way we measure these things is a little strange. What that is, that's the quarterly drop at an annual rate. There's actually about a 9% drop this quarter from the previous quarter, but then they annualize it, which almost means they multiply it by 4. There's a little more complicated math involved, but basically we dropped 9% from which is it's a huge drop. Now our forecast for this year for the U.S. we just released yesterday shows a drop in GDP of a little less than 5% for the year. Now what that says is obviously we're a lot worse than that now, but we're going to see some comeback as the year progresses. And this a lot depends on the virus, and we don't know everything's going to happen there. But that's kind of what we're looking at. And here's the interesting thing about this: if you follow politics at all, today's July the 30th. We got these numbers in that said 33% drop. Okay, we're going to get a number in on October the 30th, for the third quarter. That's about 3 or 4 days before the election. We're going to get a number in, and it's going to show the improvement we've made since then. And they'll annualize it again, just like they did today. So it may be it won't get us all the way back. And I think that's the key point. But from a PR perspective, if you're running for office, it may be a 12, 15, 20% increase in the third quarter. And that's going to look really good for some folks. They'll say, oh, we're coming back. It's all over. Everything's done, and yet we'll still be way behind where we were. And the other thing you have to think about with these numbers is when I say we're going to lose 5% over last year, in a normal year, we would have gained 2 or 3%. Not only are we, so the loss is what we're losing relative to last year, but also what we didn't grow this year. And we think it'll probably be mid-2022, something like that, before we get back to where we were in 2019. Much less make up that difference. It'll take a couple more years to make up the difference. But we think it's going to be about the same. About 22 years, 24 months, 26 months, something like that, to get back where we were. In the Great Recession, it took 58 months. So it was a very, very slow recovery that time around because we had all these structural problems in the economy with the banking system. We don't have those now. What about Texas? Actually, we've done a little bit worse in the country, and that's fairly unusual for us in economic situations. But obviously, the reason for that is the oil and gas industry, primarily. It's taken a huge hit, and I know that's not a big part of the economy in Austin, and I won't spend a lot of time on it. But I do want to emphasize a couple of things here to kind of give you the perspective. The demand for oil in the world dropped 25% in 35 days. Now think about that. That's almost impossible. The amount of energy we derive from hydrocarbons dropped 25% in a little over a month. The only way that can happen is if virtually the whole world shuts itself down. And that's the situation that we saw. That's the situation we're dealing with. Now, at the same time that was going on, Russia and Saudi Arabia were fussing with each other, and they were talking about increasing production, which would make it even worse. And in reality, they ended up making a deal later, of course, as they always do. But that made the markets get all nervous. Oil prices even went negative one day. And the reason they went negative was it was the day that the contracts expire, which means whoever owns the oil at the end of that day has to take delivery. And what had happened was for a month there, we'd had this huge drop in demand, not much drop in supply. So we were producing too much oil every day, and we'd run out of places to store it. We filled up the tanks, we filled up the tankers, we run out of place to store it. And so literally that day, people were paying people to take it off their hands that had a place they could put it. And so we got into a weird situation for one day there, and then it sorted itself out. But nonetheless, that market took a huge hit. It is coming back reasonably well. There's certainly a lot of damage to the companies, but as far as the industry is concerned, it's coming back reasonably well right now. The price is back up to around $40 a barrel, and that's not quite high enough to really help the Texas market. But it only needs to be about 45, 46 for a lot of people to start activity again. And so we're not that far away from what's going on and getting back to some reasonably stable level with the industry. And what's happened is, in essence, demand dropped 25 million barrels a day in round numbers. Supply, after all the agreements and all the people slowing down, dropped 13 million barrels a day. So we still had a gap, still had a glut there, still filling up storage every day. But then when we started coming back just a little bit, it didn't take long for oil demand to go back up, at least as much, because the production cuts didn't have to come all the way back. It had to come part of the way back. It's almost there. And so in essence, I think the oil industry will come back a little faster than some people think it will. But nonetheless, that's a big part of the Texas economy. I can go on and on and with some audiences, believe me, I spent 2 hours talking just about oil. We won't do that today. But unless you have enough questions about it, in which case we can talk about it more if you want to. But we're looking at Texas dropping a little bit more. Texas losing about 720,000 jobs for the year. Now, right now, we're down about 900,000 over our prior peak. So again, we have some work to do to get back to only losing 700,000 jobs for the year. That's about a 6% drop overall for the state. The Austin area, the numbers we released yesterday, we're calling for a drop of about 40,000 jobs in Austin, and getting those jobs back next year. So Austin coming back a little faster than some of the other places. Basically, maybe doing it in 18 or 19 months as opposed to 24 to 26 months. Now, again, just to give you some perspective on these numbers, right now Austin is down 52,000 jobs over last year. So it still has some. If it's going to get to 40, it's got some work to do. You know, that to be an annual average, it's got to overcome the first 6 months. It's 78,000 behind the peak employment that Austin had late last year before this thing started. But here's the interesting one: in the last 2 months, Austin's employment has come back 62,000 jobs. So you can see, if you're still down 78,000, you've come back 62. That shows you how far down you were at the worst of this back in April. And we saw that in city after city after city. And so we see Austin, for some reasons I'll talk about in a few minutes, being able to come back a little faster. And the reasons it can come back faster are, I think, very important to the college and to your program for the future and your training and all the things that you do. So I want to zero in on that a little bit toward the end. The other one big aspect of this is policy. What are we doing to try to combat this? Because all of a sudden, through no fault of anyone, a lot of folks who try to manage their money pretty well. They're good folks. They work hard. They go to work every day. They work hard. They've done so for decades. All of a sudden, don't have any income for 6 months. A lot of small businesses that have been well run, family businesses, well run for years and years and years, all of a sudden don't have any customers for 3 or 4 months. A lot of people can't sustain that. And as I said before, we need to keep the structure of the economy in place. Part of how we do that is we try to backstop some of these things that are happening. Now, I'll be the first one to tell you the government's been spending too much money. They've been spendthrifts. They haven't done the things they should have done for a long time. And both parties, both parties have done that. A friend of mine who's a very good politician used to say 10 or 15 years ago, the only difference between Republicans and Democrats was they'd both spend all the money, but the Republicans would feel bad about it. In the last 10 years, they haven't even felt bad about it. I mean, both sides have done this, and hence we come into this with a larger deficit than we should, and a larger debt than we should. But even putting that aside, that's a long-term problem. We don't have time to worry about the long term right now. We have to backstop and keep the structure together, keep families from losing their homes, keep people able to get by, try to keep the small businesses viable. There's been a one large bill and a couple of smaller bills passed already, and they're not perfect. I mean, government very rarely gets it done perfectly, and they've had some glitches in how they were operated. They sent a bunch of money to dead people and gave a bunch of small businesses money to big businesses. I mean, those kind of things happen when you have a situation like this where you're kind of building the airplane and flying at the same time as they are now. And so it hasn't been perfect, but it has made a huge difference. One of the things we saw in the numbers this morning is personal income is actually up despite output being down dramatically. And that's because we've tried to backstop some of these things. There's another bill being negotiated right now. It needs to be quick and it needs to be big. That's going to be hard to do in a political environment we're in. And there's all kinds of constituents out there, and it's an election season, but it needs to get done. It needs to get done well. And the reason is, for example, one program that was popular, that ran reasonably well, was something called the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which basically helped small businesses for a couple of months to meet their payroll. Well, when that was passed, we thought this thing was going to last a couple of months. It's lasted much longer than that. And so consequently, those same businesses are facing some difficulties again. And so those are the kinds of things you have to consider. State and local governments are hurting. Healthcare facilities are hurting. We've got to try to figure out what we're going to do with education going forward and getting and schools. That's going to take some resources. So there's a lot of things that need to be backstopped right now to keep the structure together that will allow us to grow and get back on our feet a little sooner. And as I say, it's an election year. It's not the best time to be doing that. I've been talking to folks in Congress this week and some of the committees, but it's just a very, very difficult, tough lift to get that done in election season. But they will get something done, and anything they get done will help. Apart from that, and getting almost no attention, is what the Federal Reserve is doing, our monetary system. They are really doing a lot of things to keep the structure together. They are keeping interest rates very low. Obviously, that's what you hear about. But they're also providing liquidity to banks. They're buying mortgage loans to keep the housing market stable. They bought the PPP loans from the banks so they can turn around and relend the money. They buy commercial paper to shore up the commercial sector. They're doing the things we need to keep the financial system stable. People want to compare this to the Great Depression. There is no comparison. They're so different. You can't even talk about it. But one of the differences is what caused the Great Depression to last for 10 years, by and large, was a run on the banks. We no longer have that possibility because of the things the Fed does. So it's just an entirely different environment that we have now. And what they're doing is very, very important also. I want to spend a few minutes now before we engage you in some conversation and kind of look beyond where we are right now. What's the world going to look like going forward? What does it mean for your institution and for the future of education? Those of you who read my column know the last two columns, one's been on public ed, one's been on higher ed. My Dallas Morning News editorial a couple of weeks ago was on both. So I mean, it's a very, very important topic, and how we deal with it right now is absolutely critical. But if we look beyond this pandemic, we try to look at the things that are going to change, and we know some things are going to change. We don't know exactly how they're going to change yet, but we know they're going to change. Examples, the way we shop. We were already in a mode of moving more and more to online shopping. We've accelerated that because a lot of people who didn't want to do it had to do it, and consequently we accelerated that movement. It's going to be a little different when we go back. We had already seen a trend, and you have, I guess the domain is a classic example of it there in Austin, but we've already seen a trend toward people, investors creating retail spaces that are more conducive to the way people want to shop today. Not the old traditional mall, but the open spaces and the walking areas and the recreation areas involved and that sort of thing. We'll see more of that. People get innovative, figure out more ways to get people to make people want to shop. We'll see all those kind of things change. The way we travel will certainly change some, much like it changed after 9/11. We still don't travel the way we did before 9/11, and so those things will change. The way we interact and travel and communicate, all of those things are going to change to some extent as we move forward. And but I think if you start saying what are the big things that are going to happen, one of them is I think it's going to be a bigger premium on workforce than ever before. I think we'll see a huge premium on quality workforces going forward because companies are going to need that. They're going to need people who have the flexibility to work in different environments. They're going to need people who are highly skilled. There's going to be a lot of new technology developed as a result of this. The obvious areas of the biomedical side, but there'll be other technologies developed as well because people are going to learn. That's what we do. We adapt, we innovate, and we learn to deal with things. That's what we've always done. That's what's driven our economy forever. I remember back in 2001 when we had the dot-com bust, that recession. President Bush had just been inaugurated, and he did what presidents usually do when there's a recession. He had a summit. It seems like every time there's an economic downturn, a president has a summit. And I was invited to speak at that one, and what he asked me to talk about was what was the one thing that made the U.S. a special place, and why had we been so successful for so long. And when you step back and look at it, the answer is that we are very good at doing the next big thing. We are the innovators, the creators, the ones who figure out new things. When something becomes a commodity, somebody else can do it better, faster, cheaper than we can, and it goes offshore. But we're always creating the next thing. And that's what drives us forward. Austin has clearly been a huge part of that creative economy for many, many years. And that's a very important reason and source for why Austin's almost always listed one of the fastest growing places around, the most resilient places, the best places to work and live, and that sort of thing. So workforce is going to be changing. There's going to be a real focus. There's been a movement around for the last 7 or 8 years. It really gained some momentum last year when the Business Roundtable issued a statement. The acronym is ESG. It stands for Environmental and Social Governance. And that is historically for not the last 30 years or so, the notion in corporate America has been your primary goal is to maximize shareholder value. And that's basically meant maximize shareholder value on a quarterly basis. And that the whole system was built around that. Models were built around that. Corporate compensation plans were built around that. And sometimes that could cause you to make some decisions that were maybe good in the short term, but not so good in the long term. Well, what ESG is saying is we have to look beyond that. I mean, corporations still want to make money, obviously, but look at it from a long-term perspective, from the sustainability perspective. And that says look at your workforce, look at your community, look at the health system in your community, look at the education system in your community, those kinds of things. I understand you had a session this morning on equity and diversity. Look at that. Very, very important. As people are looking forward into the future, they're going to want the kinds of communities that can provide great healthcare, great creative environments, great educational systems, great opportunities for everyone. And so the ability to do that is going to be very, very important going forward. We're going to see the economic development world is going to change. You see a lot of publicity about that all the time. You certainly had your share in Austin in the last week or so with the Tesla announcement, and how many jobs it's going to create and all the great things it's going to do for the area, and how intense the competition was for that. As we come out of this pandemic, the competition for those high quality, good economic development locations is going to be more intense than ever. And the reason is everybody throughout the world has been hurt by this virus. This virus didn't say, well, we'll hit Austin, but we'll leave Dallas alone, or vice versa. It doesn't work that way. It hit everyone, and it was an equal opportunity kicker in the teeth of economies, if you want to call it that, and really hurt everyone. So everyone coming out of it is going to be aggressively trying to improve their economies, build their economies, and make for very, very intense competition. And, all the stuff we talk about now that gets attention, the incentives and all that will still be there. But I'm telling you, they're going to look very closely at your healthcare system, your education system, the quality of life in your community, those kinds of things, your broadband capabilities. All of those things are going to get a whole lot bigger look than they did before. And that raises the importance of what you do in your institution. The other thing before I turn it over to you for some thoughts is I want to talk for just a minute about what's not going to change, because I think that may be one of the most important things that people sometimes lose sight of. The fundamental economic patterns that have been driving economic success and failure in the world have not changed because of this pandemic. We haven't changed the composition of the economy or the composition of the population because of this pandemic in a significant way. The cost factors that drive some things to be produced in one part of the world and other things to be produced in another part of the world, those things haven't changed much in this pandemic. So a lot of those big, broad, overlying factors that at the end of the day really determine the pattern that we follow, a lot of those haven't changed. And the reason I say that, right now, obviously we have double-digit unemployment rates in most places. Austin's a little lower, and it's a bad situation all the way around. But fundamentally, we still have a workforce shortage. And we have a workforce shortage because the baby boomers are retiring. The younger pool is not growing quite as rapidly. We're not bringing in as many folks from other places. And all those things those are fundamental. Those didn't change with the pandemic. So once we get through this, we're going to be right back where we were. And where the premium on training and education is going to be incredible. And many of those jobs are going to be technical jobs in healthcare, technical jobs in the various technology areas, all the kinds of things that are some of your core and key programs there for college. So those big underlying things are not changing. And we have some huge challenges in Texas. If you look at the state right now, 52% of our public school enrollment in Texas is Hispanic. And that's wonderful. I mean, it's great. Rapidly growing. It'll be 65% in just a couple of decades. That's great. Brings a lot of diversity, a lot of very positive things. The caveat is the families from which those kids come from control less than 5% of the household wealth in Texas. So we face a situation right now where 52% of the kids in rising are coming from families that have 5% of the money. That makes it very difficult to do well in school. We're finding those kids being left out, the ones that didn't have access to education in during this last month or two of school when they had to close down. 62% of those folks were Hispanic, and they're 52% of the school population. They were disproportionately hit. The same thing's true of blacks. The same thing's true of underprivileged whites. So it really doesn't matter. The point being that we have to do things to reach those folks and allow them to have a better education. If they're struggling in a subject, they're not going to get the after-school tutor or the summer enrichment program because the families simply can't afford it. A huge percentage of those kids who start into a college, virtually all of them into a community college, that start into it have to drop out for family financial reasons. So we have some real issues that we have to deal with. I know you're in the middle of your planning process right now and how to meet needs, and you're in a wonderful environment there in Austin with a lot of opportunities. But I just want to emphasize what you're doing is very, very important. It's important to the future of Texas, and it's important to the future of the country. And the forces that are driving that are not being changed by this pandemic. They're being paused for a period of time, but all those underlying forces are going to come right back on top of us going forward. So with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions, take this in direction. We're involved in a lot of stuff. If you want to get off this subject, go to some other area of the economics, I'm happy to try to do that as well. If I don't know the answer, I'll be happy to take that too. So I'm happy to engage in discussion with you at this point.
Well, thank you, Dr. Perryman. And so we'll open up the floor. And does anybody have any questions for Dr. Perryman?
You better ask something, or I'll talk about something else.
Well, so I in the work I'm doing at the college, I hear about the V shape, the W shape, the L shape, and the newest one I'm hearing is the Nike swoosh. I think that's what you know
Yeah.
as the check mark.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think that's, that's right. And I think that's what we're looking at. I mean, I honestly do. It's, we had a very steep drop. I mean, just straight down drop in a couple of months. And then we're coming back from it rapidly, but not as rapidly as we fell. And that kind of gives you a check mark or swoosh, if you like. Yeah, that's what we seem to be looking at here. Of course, the danger is we've never had a W, and we don't want a W. But the danger is, of course, if we don't do the things we need to do to get the health thing under control, if we don't wear masks, if we don't social distance, if we don't use some common sense, and we have to backtrack, then this little recovery we have started now turn into that W and drop again. We don't want that. We don't need that. And so hopefully people will pay attention to the health professionals and do the kinds of things that are necessary to prevent that.
Okay, well, we have a question, and so the question is, can you share any insights and any information about the IT sector in Austin, information technology sector?
Sure. I mean, the IT sector in Austin is vibrant and growing. One thing Austin has done a very, very good job of over the years is back a number of years ago, and I was pleased involved with this with a guy named Pike Tower, that some of you folks probably know. Back in the day, 30 plus years ago, or 30 years ago, we were able to get MCC into Austin. And that was kind of the think tank to kind of, at that time, compete with what we thought was Japanese, a race with the Japanese on technology. And it really opened Austin up as a technology area. We got Sematech a few years later. Those really opened things up. And that brought a lot of semiconductors in. That was the first wave. Beyond that, the area has moved very successfully into software development, information technology, gaming. Now with the Dell Medical School and all the research going on there, biotechnology, with the research at UT, battery technology. So Austin's done a very, very good job of evolving as technologies evolve. Information technology is obviously a big part of that. The IT Tech Center in Austin that Ted Rappaport used to be involved in, it has some great people there. It's one of the very best in the country. And it continues to be a growing industry for the Austin area. And again, what it requires a lot of folks with the type of training that can be provided there. So it's a very, very important industry, the future of Austin, because again, Austin's right in the middle of this knowledge economy, next big thing economy, and that sort of thing. And IT is obviously a very important part of that.
Okay, well, thank you. And so a follow-up and a little bit different is generally in the economy. What is your perspective on hiring practices and the ability to hire nationally or internationally for online work? So obviously the next generation of, I don't have to go to the office, I simply have to walk to the other side of my house to go to work.
Right, yeah, and we're going to see more of that. I think it's not going to accelerate as fast in the next 5 years as it has in the past 4 months, obviously, because necessity is always the mother of invention when you get stuff like that. But yes, I mean, I think there'll be more and more of that. Again, there's going to be changes in the modes we operate and that sort of thing. In terms of hiring practices and how it impacts those, particularly on the international side, it remains to be seen, what type of, we desperately need a good immigration policy in the United States that allows us to use skilled workers and bring in skilled workers, companies that can provide workers in other places more efficiently than we're able to today. We desperately need some legislation in that arena. It's something I've worked on for a number of years and been totally unsuccessful at. But we desperately need some additional legislation there. But absolutely, I mean, I think you'll see more companies are going to have more flexibility in their workplace, and and I think there are limits to that. I mean, there are advantages to being in a room collaborating, particularly when you're in creative environments. It's very good to be in the same room and be bouncing things around, and so I think you will see. It's not like the end of the office, like some people are saying, but I think you will see a lot of changes. I think as far as the office real estate market, which is kind of a side to your question, but it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, because you're going to see probably a lot fewer people in offices, but you're also going to see a lot more square footage per person because of the need to have some safety precautions in place and that sort of thing. It's not going to be the big bullpens where there's 60, 70 people all crowded around in one place anymore. That's not going to work. It's going to have to be, so it's going to be fewer people, more square footage per person. It'll be interesting how the math works out on that, because you got two things pulling in different directions. But absolutely, things are going to change. There is going to be, I think, more remote work going forward, and accelerating at a much faster clip than it probably would have otherwise.
Okay. I have another great question. This is a little bit on federal policy. And obviously, Texas is huge in trade. And so how will federal policies regarding trade with foreign countries affect the economy here in Texas? Obviously, that we are such a big trading state.
Well, trade is very important to the economy as a whole. I mean, we live in a global society. We live in a small world, and all the technology has made it even smaller all the time. And we're completely integrated. And in the best of all worlds, you wouldn't have any of these crazy tariffs and that sort of thing. I'm old enough that I even worked on NAFTA and the new one. I think I'm the only person who's on both task forces. But we, trade is vitally important to the country. Let me bring it down to Texas for just a second. A lot of people don't realize this. Texas is the largest exporting state in the country. No one else is close. Literally, think about this for a minute. 1 out of every $6 of goods that leave this country is made in Texas. That's a phenomenal number if you stop and think about it. So when you're messing with trade, you're messing Texas. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And obviously, a lot of that is electronics. That's one of our big electronics, computing equipment, one of our 2 or 3 biggest categories of trade. Obviously, the petroleum sector is a big category of trade. And there's a number of machinery, agriculture, there's others. But a lot of the stuff that's important in Austin is obviously stuff that's exported. And so consequently, Austin has a big stake in this too. And hopefully we can get to a point where we have a little more rational trade policy, not being so quick to slap tariffs on people and that sort of thing, because all that's ultimately counterproductive.
Yeah, if those kinds of changes will impact changes. Cost of changes. So this is a question that says there's large areas that are going to be changing in the economy. You mentioned in reference shopping, travel, the workforce. If those kinds of changes won't impact or change the economic fundamentals and cost factors, then what will cause change in economic fundamentals?
Well, there'll be some economic fundamentals change. I mean, it's still going to be driven by supply and demand. Yes, at the very basic level, but there will be some fundamentals change, and what's going to change them is the creativity that's brought to bear. I mean, people. I mean, stop and think about it. I know a lot of folks on this call are probably fairly young, but the iPhone's only about 10 years old. I mean, and think of everything that's happened since then. I mean, we live in an era where people are creative. There's change. There's new investment taking place and new platforms being developed for all kinds of things all the time, and you're going to see more of that. I mean, what we have suddenly done is we've created a huge market for figuring out how to live after this pandemic. We've opened up a brand new market area, and people will respond to that in creative ways and innovative ways. Some will be taking old ideas and applying them in a different way. Some will be coming up with something new. Some will be combining 2 or 3 things that you used to do into something different. But we will see a lot. We'll see a surge in creativity and innovation that takes place as a result of that. And obviously, you're in one of the innovation centers of the world there in Austin, so you're in a good place to be a part of all that.
Yeah, well, we're coming up on towards the end. And so as we think about this, I encourage everybody to think about and remember ACC's slogan, what starts here gets there. And that ties directly to being innovative, innovation, and exactly what we're trying to do with the department chairs, the deans, the academics, and instruction. Everybody, be innovative, be creative. If you need to think, get outside the box. That's going to be the piece that makes the difference. And so let's give a round of applause to Dr. Ray Perryman for an incredible session this afternoon. We hope you found this information helpful in undertaking and your planning for the academic master plan. And remember, this afternoon, we have our last session. It's a student panel with the Strata Education Network. But let's give a round of applause to Dr. Perryman, and thank you for spending time with us this afternoon.
My pleasure. I assume you're all applauding and standing up and cheering madly. I'll just make that
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
it has been great to be with you. This is a great process you're putting together here.
Thank you very much, sir.